Hi guys. In this series, I'm going to be talking about frequently missed questions. I'm going to do this after every chapter. Basically, I'm going to go through the top most frequently missed questions and take a little bit of a closer look at them, explain what the right answer was, and maybe explain why some of the other answers weren't correct, and maybe talk a little bit about how to read the text more closely for each kind of question. So we're going to jump right in. So this first question is looking at researchers who study social cognition. And here we've got each of the four answers that were options. 66% of the students said option A, 34% said option B, and 0% chose the last two options there. So from this I can kind of tell where we're thinking as a class, where we're thinking about these answers and where the confusion is. So in this question specifically, we're looking at an assumption and then what actually ends up happening. So people are assuming, researchers are assuming going into all of their projects that people are going to try and view the world as accurately as possible. Because that would be beneficial to us in a lot of situations to have a really accurate estimation of what's going on. What actually ends up happening is that people do distort reality in order to view themselves favorably. So this is kind of a tricky question because we're looking at an assumption and then what actually ends up happening. So researchers don't assume that people are going to distort reality, but sometimes they do. So it's beneficial for us to try to view the world as accurately as possible, but oftentimes that doesn't really work out that way. So social psychology had its origins in, and then it gives you a list of different types of psychology that it could be. So most of you guys did get the right answer here. This is Gestalt psychology is the right answer. And when I think about Gestalt psychology, I actually think about the definition is that the sum is more than the total of the parts. Now that makes not a whole lot of sense if you're not like super into philosophy and things like that. But when I think about this, I like to think about my hand. So when I'm thinking about my hand, I've got, 5 fingers and a palm, but separately, they can't really do a whole lot for me. Okay, so like I can't do a whole lot of tasks with just one finger or just my palm. But if I put them all together, I can grasp things or I can pick things up. And so they're showing that the total, the sum total, whole picture of my hand is more than just the addition of a palm and a finger and a thumb and all of those types of things. So that's the kind of way I remember this one. So if you ever see Gestalt, you're thinking about the sum, step back, big picture, looking at all of the different components that are at play there. Okay, this next problem is what we call an application problem, and this is actually asking you to look through an example and identify an answer based on your understanding of the example. These are kind of tricky, especially if you're just reading from a text and then trying to apply it yourself. So what I like to do is when I go through a passage, I like to sort of create these examples in my head so that next time when I come back to a question like this, I can be like, oh yeah, that's similar to what I generated for this type of question earlier on. So the question reads, a stranger approaches Emily on a campus and says he's a professional photographer. He asks if she will spend 15 minutes posing for pictures next to the student union. According to social psychologists, Emily's decision will depend on which of the following. So 87% of you guys did get the question correct. The correct answer is how Emily construes the situation. But let's talk about some of these other ones that maybe you didn't select or why those answers would be wrong. So looking at this 11% option here, option B, how well dressed the man is. This is actually really important, and there's a lot of social psychology research looking at how appearance can affect trustworthiness. But right now we're looking at overall how Emily construes the situation. So it's more important how she's interpreting it than how he is dressed. So that's kind of a tricky one. Because we're looking at what the man does and then how it matters to Emily. So the most important part being how it matters to Emily. All right, so the next question here is looking at the fundamental attribution error. And this is a topic that will come back again and again. This is a really big part of social psych, and we'll revisit again in chapter 4. But I wanted to talk through a couple of these definition type questions. So this is like a definition type question. They're giving you exactly the term that is used in the book and the definition that was given in the book. So I'm going to talk through why the definition is correct, and then also go into what kinds of application type scenarios I might make up in my head to help me remember this topic. So the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to explain our own and others' behavior entirely in terms of personality traits, underestimating the power of social influence. Okay, so overall, social influence is much, much more predictive of behavior and attitudes than personality traits. Now, as somebody that has never studied social psychology might think that it's the other way around. They might think that, oh, that person is a really lazy person, so that's going to be what determines their behavior later on. It's actually totally the other way around. The situation has so much to do with how we think and feel and behave. So remember, overall, social influence is going to be the one always that makes us behave the way that we behave. So in terms of taking this very dry definition, I guess, and making some examples out of it to help us understand it, I always like to remember the experience of being cut off in traffic. So, I mean, I will admit to a certain amount of road rage here, but when I'm driving down the road and somebody cuts me off, I get really frustrated, and immediately I'm like, that guy is the worst. You know, he's just a really inconsiderate driver. Maybe I would use some stronger language than that, to be honest with you guys. But overall, I'm going to make some assumptions about his personality. I'm not going to really look at the power of social influence. So, for example, he might have been trying to get over into my lane for 3 miles and his exit's coming up, so it actually was beneficial for him to get over, even though he is a really good driver. But as the driver behind him, I'm attributing things to his personality traits, him being lazy or irresponsible or something like that, rather than actually looking at the situation. Similarly, if you show people a picture of, for example, somebody sitting on a couch, they will often say things like, oh, that person is lazy, or that person doesn't work hard, or something like that, when actually we don't have any context other than that the person was sitting on that couch at that exact moment. They could have just been, running a mile and then happened to sit down afterwards. We don't really have that much information and to assume anything about their personality traits. So a lot of the predictive power of behavior and attitudes actually comes down to social influence and not personality traits. We'll come back to this example a little bit later in this video. Okay, so that was the top commonly missed questions this chapter. I'll come back again with chapter 2 to go over some misconceptions there. But my tips overall from looking at the data from this chapter, my tips are to use the flashcards at the end of the chapter. On that summary page, they give you a really great way to look at the definitions and then also the word associated with them. So if you can get that association to be pretty quick, that'll help you out a lot on the exam because it is timed. But also with those, make sure that you're generating examples for yourself while reading. This can be really difficult to do, especially if you're not sure, which concepts do I need to generate examples for? My best advice there is to generate an example for anything that has a definition. So, for example, social cognition would be a good one to generate an example for. Fundamental attribution error would be a great one to generate an example for. If you can remember my Gestalt example with the fingers versus the whole hand. And just identifying those terms that would be most important to apply later on is really the tricky part. Practice applying definitions. So a couple of slides ago, we were talking about this really sort of dry definition. Where'd it go? Yep, this one. Really sort of dry definition of how we are explaining others and people's behavior entirely in terms of personality traits. Well, what I did when I went through that is to generate a couple of examples to make it clear how those personality traits versus social influence are different. So when you're going through reading, if you can make some examples like that for yourself, that'll be really helpful when it comes time to the test. Also test yourself. Make sure that you're not looking at your notes. Flashcards are a really great way to do this. But testing yourself where you're not looking at your notes will only make you faster in terms of recall time for the exam. That could be really important for you. Also, my best advice is try to finish chapter 4 on Friday. The test isn't actually due, it's open for 2 days, but it's open on Friday and Saturday. So you can finish chapter 4 a little bit early so you have more time to study all 4 chapters as a whole, because I know it is a lot of information. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is talk about fundamental attribution error a little bit more, because coming up with examples of these are kind of tricky. So this question reads, all of the following are examples of fundamental attribution error except, and these are your 4 options. You're looking at, you see a man slip on the sidewalk and decide he's clumsy. Later, you find that the patch of sidewalk is covered with black ice. So here we're looking at, we're attributing his behavior to a personality trait, right? Clumsy. And later we find the patch of sidewalk is covered with black ice. That's a situational factor. So we're looking at personality versus situation. Your boyfriend brings you flowers and you're immediately suspicious of what he must have done and what you will be angry about. That one doesn't really apply here. We're not looking at a personality trait of the boyfriend, and the situation isn't really mentioned here. We're not looking at a situation versus personality type of scenario. This next option gives us the resident assistant in your dorm, gives an anti-drinking lecture, and you decide she's no fun, even though you know the lecture is school policy. Well, here you've attributed a personality trait to her, even though you know that the lecture is school policy, so that's the situational factor. And your last option here is the professor can be found at her office all hours of day or night, and you decide she's a workaholic. So that's a personality assumption, even though you know she's up for promotion soon. So that's the actual situational factor that's causing the behavior. So if you test yourself here, go ahead and give yourself a second to decide what you think it is. Right, and the correct answer was B. Your boyfriend brings you flowers and you're immediately suspicious. Now, we're going back to the question here. This is all of the following are examples of fundamental attribution error except for B, because this one really doesn't have anything to do with fundamental attribution error. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks for watching this video. I'll come out with chapter 2 later today. Thanks.